Welcome back to Young Heretics Conversations. This is my interview series where I get to talk with authors and thinkers who are out there doing interesting things in the world that catch my eye. Usually, when I introduce this series, I explain it as a way of raising our heads up from the musty old books to make contact with the real world. This is a show about Western culture, Western civilization, and it's the classical education that you didn't know you were missing, which means mostly what we do is we read. This stuff has its own inherent value. We're working through the Aeneid right now, and it's like every page could take up an entire episode because these texts are so rich. They have so much to say about eternal truths, ongoing and enduring aspects of human nature, dynamics that never change, things that we always want to know about, always care about. But we all live in time and we are creatures in the world and we're supposed to be engaging with current affairs. So I like to take the stuff that we read and discuss it with people who are out there engaged in what the ancients might have called practical philosophy or practical wisdom. That is, they're thinking about how to act in the world, what to do politically, what we ought to do as a country, that sort of thing. And today's guest, Major Doron Spielman, is a perfect guy to talk about that with because he's written this book called When the Stones Speak, the remarkable discovery of the city of David, that gives a perfect example of how scholarship and texts and literary analysis are not only incredibly cool and they reveal all sorts of awesome stuff about history that you would never think was possible, but they also are urgently relevant to the moment. The excavation of the ancient city of Jerusalem is something that obviously holds a certain degree of academic interest, but also is part of this incredibly contested political situation in the Middle East. And the way that those two things have intersected is kind of just astonishing, remarkable to me, because on the one hand, it goes all the way back to the politics of ancient Mesopotamia. On the other hand, that same politics is in many ways still affecting politics today. Obviously, this is a very fraught region, very fraught moment for the region. We've talked a fair bit about it recently on the show because this is a show about Athens and Jerusalem. But Major Spielman has a distinctive perspective on it that I think you're really going to enjoy. So let's bring him on. All right, I'm here with Major Doron Spielman. He is the international spokesman for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and he's written what is now a New York Times best-selling book called When the Stones Speak. It's about the excavation of the city of David, one of the true adventure stories in the history of archaeology. Major Doron, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Spencer. Thank you so much for having me. And I love your background.
Thank you. Yes, it's there to make me seem marginally credible. We call it the credibility book show.
I'm happy to be there. It's an honor.
That's great to have you. So I was thinking you could maybe start out just by telling us a little bit, because I think most people, most even educated people, might not know what you mean when you say the city of David. We hear a lot about Israel and Jerusalem in the news, and maybe people think that's kind of where it stops. That's just it's the city and there's a country and what more is to talk about. But the city of David is something quite different and specific. Can you tell us what it is?
Sure. Well, first of all, we're all in good company because up until 100 plus years ago, no one knew what the city of David was, and the reason is that Jerusalem is unlike any old city in the entire world because every other old city in the entire world, whether it is Athens or Rome or wherever else you're going to look, they're inside the old city walls, right? It would make sense, except for one old city, which is actually Jerusalem, which is probably the most well-known old city that has a beautiful wall around it. It's in all the postcard pictures, but I mean, it is an old city. What's in those walls? It's 2,000 years old, but I think I have a Bible here behind me. If you open up the pages of the Bible and you look for archaeology that's related to that time period, it's not in those old city walls. And in fact, it is in the city of David, which is located outside those old city walls. And so the way that this was discovered was actually Queen Victoria in 1867 was looking for the stuff that's in the Bible. She was looking for the Ark of the Covenant. And just out of Indiana Jones, she sent an explorer whose name was Captain Charles Warren to Jerusalem. And the first place Warren goes is to the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, tries paying off the Ottoman guards, the Muslim guards, and he thinks he's going to get lucky. After he pays, they say, listen, you can't dig here, but you can go dig near the Western Wall. So he goes to the Western Wall and he's digging, moves the rabbis out of the way. He's digging trenches, which can still be seen. It's unbelievable. When you're there, there's fiberglass around them. And he digs down next to the Western Wall, and he's still not finding anything biblical. And he's going to be a failure. And so one day he writes in his diary, he leaves the old city walls to get some fresh air and walk along the hills of Jerusalem. And he walks through a potato field down to a valley, and he sees some children walking away with pots full of water. And he sees that there's a stream. Freshwater spring is very rare in Jerusalem, and he drinks it. It's fresh. And he sees the water is not flowing into a valley or collected in a pool. It's flowing into a hole into the bedrock of the mountain. So Captain Charles Warren squeezes through this hole, and he's walking through a water tunnel, which all of us can do to this day. I've done it about 1,000 times with a torch and holding a lantern, actually. And after around 50 meters of squeezing through this narrow water channel, and just amazed, he looks over his head and he sees a shaft. And he climbs up the shaft. He only gets about halfway. Eventually, his archaeological workers help him. And when he gets to the top, he discovers an underground city beneath a mountain outside the old city walls of Jerusalem. And after 27 archaeological excavations and 2 decades of my life, which I'm privileged to have, we have now discovered that the actual ancient city of Jerusalem was sitting there like Atlantis, buried beneath a hill outside of the old city walls of Jerusalem. So that is a long way for me to answer your question, Spencer. It's just unreal. The old city's old, but the real old city is the city of David.
I mean, when you say this is like Indiana Jones, you're not kidding. This is actually the subject of one of the major Indiana Jones movies, right? Is the Lost Ark, the Ark of the Covenant is what they're looking for in that film. And it speaks to something that I talk about a little bit on this show sometimes, which is that people, at least people my age, and I think everybody currently alive of any age, grew up with archaeology as a staple of the world. It was in our history books. The findings were sort of built into general common knowledge. And as you indicate, if you open a modern Bible, there will be information about this sort of stuff there. So it's easy to slip into thinking that this is just one of those things that's kind of always been known. It's just part of the store of human knowledge. Whereas in fact, the reign of Queen Victoria, not that long ago in human terms. And we have just lived through an explosion of our historical knowledge, which in many cases, I think has sort of fleshed out and given color to what we read in the Bible. It's confirmed a lot of what we have in the Bible. You tell an amazing story in this book that is very much a prime example of that. And I'm wondering if you can recount it for us here. This stream that you're talking about, the tunnels that let water into the city, is that the same one that we read about in, when Hezekiah is defending the city against the Assyrian king? Tell us about that, because it's really just one of the most astonishing finds, I think.
It really is, and it boils down to a 15-year-old kid at the end of the day. His name was Jacob Eliyahu, and this is after, Charles Warren uncovered this shaft, but so this water tunnel is known, and there was no archaeological fascination back in the 1860s. People were just, shepherding their sheep to this water spring. And an archaeology and excavation happened here and there. But 15 years after Charles Warren, there's a young kid named Jacob Eliyahu. He's got a sheep, and he's shepherding them through the mountains, and they're drinking from the same spring. And so he's a curious kid, and he goes into the same tunnel, but in the backside of what Captain Charles Warren said at the end. And he's walking, the sheep are drinking, and he tells people afterwards he slipped and fell. And when he falls into the water, he's alone. He's picking himself back up. And as he does so, his hand touches something that is an extrusion from the wall, popping out of this bedrock wall. And he's not sure. So he goes outside, has a torch, lights it up, walks in, and he sees on this protrusion figures, ancient drawing. He can't read the writing. He's a Jewish kid, but it looks like Hebrew, but he's not sure. And he goes out and he tells a bunch of people, and they come in. And what he found was the oldest biblical inscription ever found at that time, which is an inscription that says how that tunnel was made and carved by two groups of people digging that tunnel 2,800 years ago. This is the time of Hezekiah, that they meet from opposite ends in the middle of that tunnel. And it's written in Paleo Hebrew, dated to the 8th century BC. Now, why is it so awesome? It's because of what you're saying. Because if you look in the Bible, in the book of Kings, or in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 32, Jerusalem of the Jews was about to be besieged by Sennacherib, who was an unimaginably powerful figure in the ancient world. There's no comparison to him today.
Yeah, the Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, right? That's
exactly. That's exactly right. Exactly. That was the analogy. And we can't even imagine such a person. I don't know, the Hitler-esque kind of figure of evil, the Darth Vader or the Emperor. And so he is now besieging Jerusalem. He's going to destroy the Jewish people. And had that happened, there'd be no Jews, no Christians, no Bible, no America. And King Hezekiah has this idea. He says, he's going to attack the city the same way King David did, by capturing the water, which is in the Bible. So the Bible clearly states that he took the water and he diverted the water secretly inside the city walls. And when Sennacherib tries to besiege the city, he cannot find the water. And the Bible recounts later, it says that King Hezekiah prospered in all the things he did, and specifically cites this water tunnel. So it was because he was able to divert the water inside the city walls that Sennacherib didn't attack Jerusalem. The Jewish people survived. The Bible is written. Christianity's here. America's here. And it all comes down and is recorded on that plaque found by a 15-year-old kid. And also, if I could just even overexpand this.
Please, this is the best part of this. I think what you're about to say is the best part of this.
Yeah, that it was found in Assyria by a bunch of archaeologists, right? So a bunch of archaeologists are in Sennacherib's palace, and they find 3 cylinders in that area, one of which is in the British Museum. It's the one that I know the best because I've been there. It's called Taylor's Prism. Taylor found it. And on it, Sennacherib describes the exact same story with one slight difference, right? So Sennacherib describes, I conquered these people, conquered these people, conquered these people. It gets to Jerusalem and the text changes. He looks like he's a bit confused. The scribe says, well, we captured it, but we didn't conquer it. We trapped Hezekiah in the city like a bird in a cage. And then it just moves on. And it's just so amazing because you can see the political, the spin where Sennacherib has it. We have it Sennacherib, we have it in the Bible, and we have it in the field. The triangulation here, Spencer, is just the Bible's like jumping off the pages in your face.
Oh my gosh. I mean, this is like what the kids call cope, I think, which is when you like get kind of owned, but you have to pretend to find some way of spinning it so that everything is fine. Those cylinders that you're describing, I mean, this was very much standard practice, right, for the Mesopotamian kings, and the Assyrians were notorious, even among the warlords, for their bloodthirstiness. I always think about Ashurbanipal, who hung the head of the king of the Elamites from a tree in his pleasure palace. This is the kind of guys we're talking about. So if there was any way that they could have taken the city, they surely would have. It was not in any way in their nature or part of their policy to just kind of go all the way up to the edge of this obscure kind of Western town and then pack up and go take their toys and go back home. So there's obviously something that's happened here. And he's traveling from the north, right? He's coming down through kind of the rest of the cities of Jerusalem, or of Israel rather. And he gets to Jerusalem and he's like, and then I just totally freaked him out. I kind of put him like a bird in a cage, which is a wonderful example of the Bible actually giving kind of fuller information. Talk a little bit about, you mentioned that you've had a great deal of personal involvement in this excavation effort in the modern day. Tell us how you got involved and what your career has been devoted to in this domain.
So for me, you had mentioned that I'm an IDF major in the IDF, and that's actually what brought me to the city of David. I was involved in, ironically, we're talking about the Bible, in the terrorists had taken over, Hamas, who we all know now, had taken over the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem in 2002. And I was sent there as a soldier. So, the Church of the Nativity is a Christian holy site. It's in the actual city of Bethlehem. And there I had a meeting with a young woman, a chance meeting I described in the book, a harrowing meeting with a woman that I'd grown up with in college. And she and I now meet on a battlefield. And a lot of things unfolded, which are in the book. And one of the things that unfolded were really she and I did not see eye to eye at all on the existence of the state of Israel. And this kind of really shocked me because she was really convinced that the state of Israel had no right to exist. And for me, I left this experience just very shaken. And I saw the soldiers that were witnessing my exchange with her and realizing they looked, these strong soldiers, men and women, looked like they were just completely defenseless against these claims. And I really decided to devote my life to trying to somehow deal with the story of the Jewish people. And here God comes in, clearly, if I can just say, because I turned to my wife, Sarah, at the time we were dating, and I said, look, honey, I got to find something to do. I was working in business and in serving as a reservist. And she said, pray.
That's a keeper. That's how you know. That's why you married her, right?
Right, exactly. But it says, in the Bible, it says God told Abraham, listen to Sarah. So I had to listen to my wife, Sarah, and I actually prayed. And the funny thing is that night, I was calling a tour guide that I knew in Jerusalem to invite him to my wedding. And he said to me, you know something? I've been meaning to take you to this new excavation in Jerusalem. I know you love archaeology. And I said, what is it? He said, it's called the City of David. And I said, isn't that near the Arab village of Silwan? Like, I didn't even know the site existed. And this tour guide named Moshe, he took me to the site. And I saw a group of around 20 people who had dedicated their lives basically to unearthing the ancient city of David, because since this wonderful discovery made in time of Queen Victoria, the site had essentially gone back and forth through so many wars and was now settled by tons of homes, mostly Arab homes, and was deemed kind of, not exactly safe, that it had just kind of gone passé in terms of trying to excavate it. And they had really dedicated themselves to going to excavate it. And I threw in my lot with them, and I left my job in high tech, and I threw in my lot with them. And then everything really changed for me in 2004. And I'll explain it. It's very much connected to the book. So in 2004, we had a small visitor center, and we were digging and helping tourists go through Hezekiah's tunnel, which is a great experience. And an archaeologist walks into our office. Her name is Dr. Eilat Mazar, of blessed memory. She's the granddaughter of one of the great archaeologists in Israel. And you have to imagine, we have like a little shed as an office. And she lays an aerial map on our desk. And she said, there was a pillarhead, capital, made by the Phoenicians that was found, and she points to the map just about 20 meters from where we're sitting.
The Phoenicians, I'll just say for listeners of the show, we've been doing the Aeneid. So the Phoenicians are the people from whom Dido ultimately descends, one of the great seafaring empires of the ancient world.
That's right. And in fact, they, along with most of the others, go out of existence because of Sennacherib and the Assyrians. I mean, he essentially kind of eliminated them and the Philistines and pretty much everybody else. And so, correct, the Phoenicians were the great artists. And she said, you have this beautiful artistic capital, and we know it was made by Phoenicia. And I'm kind of listening to her, and I'm thinking, like, this is a great story. I know this. It's on the 5-shekel coin of today. And she goes, no. She looks at me. She goes, Doron, you're missing the point. She opens up the Bible, and she said, right after King David captures Jerusalem in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, it says King David wants to build himself a palace, and he doesn't have any artisans. The Jews weren't great artisans, and he calls the king of Phoenicia, Hiram, who was living in Tyre, the capital of Phoenicia. And King Hiram builds King David's palace. So she said, if there's a capital here made by the Phoenicians, King David's palace is somewhere nearby. And I said, so where? And she points at the floor. She goes, well, I think it's around 20 feet below where we're sitting. And I remember tapping the floor with my foot. It was this junky floor. I'm thinking, like, this can't be. So I said to her, Eilat, what do you need? She's like, well, I need you to tear down your office, clear it out of the way, and give me $500,000. And I am literally laughing. But Eilat Mazar had a good stroke of luck. And in fact, we found a donor to do just that. And we clear out our office, and she digs down. And directly beneath our office is one of the highlights of the city of David today, a massive palace. And the walls of this palace, it is the fortifications of the largest structure ever found in Israel, from the 10th century BCE, which is smack dab in the middle of the time of King David. And there's a lot of archaeological debate around this, but there's less today because carbon dating is so sophisticated now that originally we found only one olive seed, which was sent to Oxford and dated. Now we have found hundreds of very minute matter, which is now in 2024 been published, which documents very clearly the city was at its height during the time of King David. But there's an archaeological debate going back and forth. And finally, we get proof that the David's dynasty was there. And may I continue, or am I taking up?
Not at all. No, please keep going.
There's a debate going on, and certain archaeologists that are called more skeptical, called minimalists, are saying it's got nothing to do with the Bible. Now we know, like anything, if you have a structure that's in use, like the White House, right? Let's just say you close the White House doors today and someone came back in 1,000 years. Well, they'll see a house that goes back to the early time of the founding fathers, just after George Washington, but they'll see the structure. But if they look inside, the only underwear they're going to find is from President Trump, right? They're probably not going to find Biden's underwear, and I can make some bad jokes.
I should hope so, right? Yeah,
exactly. Let's hope not. Or Obama's underwear, or this or that. You'll find the structure that's old, but the stuff of the last person there. So we have the structure of King David, but the last person in the Bible to live in King David's palace was his great-great-great-grandson, Hezekiah. He's the last of the line. So Elatmazar calls me a year after the dig, and she found a clay seal that had been stamped by a signet ring and hardened. She found it in a layer of ash. Now, the ash, she said, dates to 586 BC, which is the date of the destruction of the first temple. The name on this is none other than, and it didn't mean anything to me now, but it certainly then, but it does now, is Yehuchal, the son of Shelemiah. Now, who is this person? Yehuchal, the son of Shelemiah, in chapter 36, 37, and 38 of the book of Jeremiah, is sent by King Zedekiah to kill the prophet Jeremiah. And we find his clay seal with his name, his father's name, and his grandfather's name in the actual structure that goes back to the time of King David.
Wow. It's really just astonishing. I mean, we have this problem in the modern day that we're time prejudiced. Just generally, we sort of assume that we're the first people to come up with historical dating methods and to know the truth of pure reason that emerged sometime around the Enlightenment. But even leaving that aside, I think there's a weird effect that takes place when a text is as old as the Bible, or even really any ancient text, that we think it can't possibly, it must somehow be distorted by time. There must be some kind of warping that takes place. And so when this degree of specificity, the confirmation that comes up with these very precise, obscure characters whom most people probably couldn't name or place in the Bible, and then you find their seal kind of pressed into some sort of physical material, I do think that kind of changes our understanding of what kinds of texts these are. Yes, they're theological texts. Yes, they're prophetic, but they're also historical in this very kind of specific and even like almost workaday. These are the annals of the kingdom. You said something just in passing that I really want to return to and emphasize, which is, if Sennacherib takes Jerusalem, there's no Israel, there's no Christianity, there's no America, I think is how you put it. And this is very much in keeping with the point and purpose of this show, which is a show about the West, this is a show about Athens and Jerusalem, that you need both sides of that coin to make what we think of as Western culture, Western civilization. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, the stakes of this work that you're doing for the contemporary world. What is it that makes this not just fascinating and interesting to people like us that like kind of nerdy stuff, but actually urgently important and politically relevant?
Well, that has been a large part of the story, and this is a large part of the book. And the reason is once we found those seals, there were really two reactions, Spencer. There were like two massive shockwaves, I should call them. One shockwave was for people like, you and me and your audience who are astounded, and many people in the world, that exactly what you said. Wow, that dusty Bible, like let's blow off the dust, and goodness me, it's real. And I've seen that reaction, by the way, from the craziest groups of people who've come to visit me. For teenagers, it's Demi Lovato. For us, it's Seinfeld, Helen Mirren for the older generation. I mean, Captain Kirk. I've had almost this entire current cabinet. I mean, I've had skeptics who just cry. And so that's one reaction, right? Most of the reaction. The other reaction is, wow, this means something really bad. And we have to stop this at all costs. And that reaction is coming from a specific group of people, mostly fanatical regime leaders, such as heads of Qatar, as it's now called, the head of Hamas, Palestinian Authority, who've been pushing a narrative which we've, for some reason, been ignoring for decades to young Palestinians, which is that the only narrative in Jerusalem is that of Muhammad. And it flies. Now, Muhammad never thought this. Let's be very, very clear. I mean, the Quran is super clear.
It seems to take for granted. I mean, the Quran takes for granted that there are Jews present in.
It mentions the Jews 8 times and the children of Israel 40 times. It never mentions Palestine and never Jerusalem. But Muhammad knew his closest friend was Ka'ab, a Yemenite Jewish rabbi. I mean, it was so obvious. He could never. He'd be turning in his grave if he understood what's happening. But for political reasons, upon the founding of the State of Israel, in an attempt to create an alternative, somewhat narrative, the idea came out that, well, no, Jerusalem really goes back to the time of Muhammad. And this has taken root to such a degree that even the imam of the biggest mosque in Israel, Ikrima Sabri, Friday he has the most captive audience. He often says, and I'll quote him exactly, any stone that you turn over in Jerusalem, not a single one of them has a marking of the Jews. Or it is the art of the Jews to deceive the world. Or I have all these, even Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, and I think the people of the Palestinian Authority are really the ones to suffer, said just 1 month ago, if there was a temple, it was in Yemen. So, yeah. So, I mean, what does that mean for you and me and the founding fathers and founding mothers of America and our entire tradition? Basically, it means, well, there's no temple, there's no Judaism, there's no monotheism. And what happened here was it took hold, and it took hold not only in the Middle East and amongst young Muslims who did not know any better. It took hold in institutions like the United Nations and many other institutions that were really out to say that Israel needs to be divided, and specifically, here I'll boil this down, that Jerusalem needs to be divided. And according to that division, the city of David is no longer in Israel. And so that's a slight inconvenience. If the very reason why the Jewish people exist and can trace their roots back to Israel and Christians and even Muslims is no longer in Israel. And so when we discovered this site, yes, they basically made a decision. It started with the Muslim Brotherhood, and it still is very much them, although we've battled back considerably, made a decision to destroy this site at any cost. And I spent around much of those 2 decades, and this is what goes into the book, trying to continue to excavate the site while standing strong against threats, both physical, legal, and even at one point it reached the White House and the State Department, who had really been duped into coming down against the excavation. And we weathered these insane years. But yes, there was an attempt to destroy the archaeology of the city of David and rebury the site. And it's because it shows, with every shovel, every single day in the city of David, it shows that the Jewish people are what we know, indigenous to the land of Israel. And that was a very scary concept.
Yeah, the title of your book, right, When the Stones Speak, it puts me in mind as a Christian immediately of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. You know, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. But it's funny that we live in this time when the concept of erasure is such a politically potent concept. Oh, I'm being erased from this or that. You know, Black indigenous people of wheelchairs are being erased from, you know, superhero movies or whatever. And this is as exact and literal an instance of an attempted erasure as perhaps you could come up with. That there, you know, that those who find it politically inconvenient for there to be a Jewish settlement that is ancient and, as you say, kind of indicates indigeneity in Israel, just are making the most kind of outlandish claims to rewrite this history, that like the temple was in Yemen or what have you. Um, I'm curious, I've had a few authors on the show recently who have written books about Israel, either ancient Israel or the modern nation state or some combination of the two. And I know, having written books myself, that the process is kind of funny timing wise, in that you start a book in one moment and political climate and culture, and you finish it in another, and then it probably comes out into the world in yet another moment where things are very different. You, I assume, were writing this book and kind of in the process when the situation for Israel changed dramatically with the horrific events of October 7th. So I'm curious kind of how that has affected your approach to these issues and the reception of the book as well.
Well, yes, it made it real in a way I really even I hadn't anticipated. So I wrote the book twice, actually. You're correct, Spencer. The first time I wrote the book was in 2023, and I had just taken some time off from the city of David and was sitting to write the story of what we're talking about the battle over the archaeology and the incredible discoveries and what's at stake. And ironically, on October 8th, I was supposed to be sitting with my editor. And on October 7th, my life changed and I was immediately called into the army. It was a holiday. It was the Shabbat, Sabbath. I left my family and basically for 97 days straight came face to face with the horrors of what humans are able to do at their very worst. And my brothers and sisters having been annihilated. And I'll tell you when it really hit me. And when I realized, whoa, what the book meant was on October 8th, the day I was supposed to be with my editor, that morning I was down south at the kibbutzim. And what had happened was I went down because I'm a spokesman to the foreign press. I went down early to see the situation and try to understand if I can open this up to the world at all. And what they would be saying and how dangerous it was. And it was a dangerous mission in itself that I was down there because the fighting was still going on. But I actually reached a road just before all the kibbutzim where there were hundreds and hundreds of cars where the people in those cars had been killed. And I was alone there with two other soldiers. It was imagine looking at a street extending for 500 yards in each direction, and it's you and two other people, because all the first responders had already taken out the bodies or they had been taken hostage. And I opened up the door of one of those cars, and the driver's registration is on the seat. I explain this in the book. And I'm holding it up, looking at this bloody driver's registration, just thinking, who is this guy? Like, probably dead. And the soldier with me said, look down at your feet. And I look down and I see him standing on a pile of white zip ties, like that you use to close. And I said to him, Liad, I said, what is this? And he said, these people were either killed or they were taken hostage because those were used to bind their hands. And at that moment, my life changed. And I looked around at these cars and the word had gotten out what Hamas had called the attack. They didn't call it the Gaza war, and they didn't call it the war in southern Israel. They called it the Al-Aqsa flood. Al-Aqsa is the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, which is in Jerusalem, an hour and a half drive away. They were clearly carrying out this war over the battle of the very indigenous nature and the very identity of Jerusalem. Is a flood going to take over Jerusalem and turn it into a caliphate, if I may speak frankly, of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is what Hamas is, along with many of the other regimes in the Middle East? Or is it going to stay the cradle of Western civilization? And at that point, when I looked around, I said, something? I've been writing a book about our problems in the city of David. This is where that leads. If someone is out to erase your history, I said, I felt guilt. I said, I should have known. I felt real guilt that the next thing you're going to do is to try to erase you or us. And when I went back to the book, I was a different person, and I understood more clearly, unfortunately came at an enormous cost with people I know and many people I didn't know, of if people are coming to erase Western culture, we can see what's happening on the streets of the United States. We can see what's happening in Colombia. We can see, you don't just have to be Jewish to be nervous. And these two diplomats were just killed in Washington, D.C., just for being Jewish, right? This is really an attack, Spencer, on the very source of our identity. And I realize that the city of David is ground zero for that proof. And when you can point to it, like Eilat Mazar would say, and this is why I named the book, she would always say when she heard politics, she'd say, you know what, I don't want to disagree with you. I don't want to argue. Let the stones speak. When the stones speak, they tell the truth. And that's the power of the city of David. And it's a power for good, but it really is a power of good against evil. And that is what I realized from the events on October 7th. And I've been taking it with me to the modern day, having spoken the last 10 days in the media about what's happening in the Middle East and relating it back to the shared relationship that Israel has with the United States. It's all built around the Bible, right? It's all built around culture, like you said, Greece and Jerusalem. And it's a precious connection, but that's the source of our connection.
Well, yeah, as you indicate, you don't have to be Jewish to be invested in this or to be nervous about it. You just have to look at what typically happens when people start destroying monuments. I mean, this is something that came to mind also in 2020 out here, although with much less, I would say, severity than in October. I mean, but just the symbolic destructions are always leading toward what they symbolize, which is literal destruction. And as you indicate, you know, it would be great if it didn't take these sorts of atrocities to drive these sorts of points home, but it does give a reminder or something that the reason that I do these interviews, mostly this is a show about enjoying Western culture and talking about the significance of like Latin poetry and things like that. But every now and then you want to remind yourself that it's not simply a parlor game. It's a real life and death, often high stakes scenario. And it's kind of our task to preserve this culture. So thank you very much, Major Doron Spielman. It's been a true pleasure having you on. Appreciate the work you're doing. And if my listeners haven't already, they should go pick up a copy of When the Stones Speak, the New York Times bestselling book. It really is terrific. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Spencer. And to all of your audience, we hope to see you in the city of David and in Jerusalem soon.